Again, everybody, thanks so much for joining us here at Online Home Church this morning. It's great to see your bright and shining faces all around our nation today as we celebrate the fifth Sunday of Easter, and in particular, this past Thursday, April 25th, the feast of St. Mark the Evangelist. We just heard in our gospel lesson today from the Gospel of John that Jesus is telling his apostles and followers that he is the vine and God is the vine grower. As we use this analogy throughout our discussion today of the life and ministry of St. Mark, I hope that you'll keep in mind that as the vine and God as the vine grower, that Jesus gives us very clear instructions that we as the vine are part of Jesus himself, that we abide in him and that he abides in us. And as we take on this role of being the vine ourselves, we recognize that our goal is to share the love of God that we hear about in our epistle today, share the love of God with others, and go out into the world like branches of this vine to share the good news with others, that we share this good news with them and make them disciples of Christ. But first, we need to talk about St. Mark. There's a lot to unpack here, and one of the reasons we're discussing this is, as I mentioned, his feast day was this past Thursday, April 25th. The other is that in our lectionary year, we are discussing Mark throughout the next year. We'll be every gospel, or the majority of our gospel lessons throughout this year are going to be from the Gospel of Mark. Just as a reminder, everybody, we are in a lectionary that a lot of churches use in all denominations, including Catholic and other Protestant churches. And in that lectionary format, we have years A, B, and C. As you'll see at the top of your readings from our church website today, we're in year B because it goes Matthew is A, Mark is B, Luke is C. And then at various times of the year, we hear from the Gospel of John throughout the year, regardless of what lectionary cycle we're in. So this is year B, and we've been reading the Gospel of Mark really since the season of Advent. It's an important gospel for a number of reasons. The first and probably foremost is he was first. By all scholarly accounts, Mark was the first gospel to be written, and although there's some scholarly debate about whether Mark was an actual person or just an accumulation of different stories, the church tradition and the legend that goes with Mark is that he wrote this gospel himself, not based on eyewitness accounts, but by being an interpreter and a scribe for St. Peter. Just like Paul had a scribe, Luke, his physician, and Luke wrote the Gospel and ultimately Acts of the Apostles as a 2-volume set, the church legend and tradition is that Mark went around with Peter as he was spreading the good news throughout ultimately Jerusalem, Judea, and the Roman Empire. And so when scholars are talking about, well, who wrote Mark and when was it written, two very basic questions here to celebrate the feast of St. Mark, the scholarly consensus is there's no real answer. The church tradition is very clear, and that is that Mark wrote it sometime in the mid-60s, so sometime between 64 and 66 AD, about 30 years after Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. So this is the earliest gospel, and it was written on the basis of what biblical scholars call multiple sources. In particular, the German word for source is Quelle, and so the Q source is one that Mark pretty reasonably relied on, otherwise known as the sayings of Jesus, to put this gospel together. It's the shortest of the gospels, the earliest of the gospels, and what most folks who study these kinds of things agree is the one that Matthew and Luke followed very closely, and then John followed all three. That's why our lectionary cycle is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John throughout those 3 years. So Mark's an important figure, not just in terms of the Bible and the lessons that we get from Jesus, but the message that Mark gave us is really an important one. You see, Mark as a gospel is much different than Matthew and Luke, certainly different than those two, because they were writing with his already in hand or in mind, and theirs are in many ways more organized, more chronologically arranged, and at least as far as Matthew goes, had a very more specific message. Matthew comes first in the canon, right? The way the Gospels are organized in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is based on Matthew's influence with the Jewish community at the time all of this was put together. But Mark came first and is kind of the briefest because he's writing just from, imagine somebody sitting down in the year 64 trying to put the story of Jesus and his ministry together. He probably had a lot of different pieces of papyrus around him to try and compile all these things. But he did, and he did so in a way that's not just a chronology, not just a story. He did so with a very clear message to Christians 2,000 years later. That one, Jesus was a sacrificing servant. Two, Jesus was the Messiah. And that three, as disciples of Jesus, we should likewise be ready to sacrifice and be servant leaders ourselves. So when we take a look at this this Gospel of Mark and realize this is his greatest accomplishment on earth, we also recognize why we're still 2,000 years later celebrating his feast day. The word Coptic is not one we talk about much in the Episcopal Church. It's a different branch of Christendom and one that for many folks remains, if not mysterious, then completely unheard of. For those of us here, well, I should say, for those of us who used to be here in Atlanta, for those of us in the congregation this morning from Atlanta, there is a Coptic Christian church right on Ponce de Leon near Emory University. Coptic is a word that describes the kind of the last phase of ancient Egypt. And so when people were speaking Coptic to each other, this is a kind of a derivation of the language that Pharaoh spoke to Moses. And it's kind of the last one that biblical scholars and archaeologists say, well, once Coptic was kind of dead, that was the end of the ancient Egyptian language. But Coptic is an important word for the discussion of Mark because as Mark traveled around with Peter, taking notes, listening to Peter's sermons, and trying to get all this down on paper, the Christian legend, primarily from the Coptic Church, is that Mark did so in Rome, and then once he was done with his writings, moved to Alexandria, Egypt. During the first 400 years of Christendom, Alexandria was the head of the church, both intellectually and theologically. Alexandria, much more so than Jerusalem or Rome as they are today, was really the theological center of the Christian movement. And a lot of that has to do with Mark going there and becoming the first bishop of Alexandria. Unfortunately, the message of sacrifice and service is so important that Mark is one of the first Christian martyrs. The Coptic legend and the story from the Coptic Church is that the pagan leaders of Alexandria, those folks that you just think about the Sphinx and the pyramids of Giza and all of the different images we have of Pharaoh in ancient Egypt. Imagine somebody coming to Alexandria, one of their most important cities, and starting to say, all of that's trash, all of that's rubbish, and you should disregard all of that. He was a real threat to the society and the religion of the people of Alexandria, Egypt at that time. And so the Coptic tradition is that Mark ultimately was martyred. They tied the pagan leaders of Alexandria at the time, basically treated him like they would a criminal in the Old West. He was tied to a horse and dragged through the streets until he died. Just terrible, terrible ending. But his legend, needless to say, not only is the continuation 2,000 years later of the Coptic Church, but one that we still celebrate today in the feast of St. Mark. So why is his depiction, when we see St. Mark venerated both in stained glass windows, versions of the Bible that have the four different Gospels pictured with a creature, why is Mark always associated with a lion? This gets to where Rich Sanders and the Sanders family come into play. As you all know, my dad was career Air Force and at various times stationed in Washington, D.C. It's very rare to get stationed to the same place twice when you have a long career in the Air Force. My parents were stationed both at Blytheville, Arkansas in the late 60s and late 70s, but also in Washington, D.C. at different commands in the D.C. metro area, which gave my younger brother and me the opportunity to attend St. Mark's Catholic School twice in our primary education. I attended St. Mark's as a second grader and then later as a seventh and eighth grader. Would you like some more? I got it. So St. Mark's is important to us, and it never occurred to me until we started learning as an adult later about St. Mark, his life and work, that the name of the mascot for our school at St. Mark's was the Lions. Likewise, since we have a couple of folks attending today from Texas, one of the most prominent private schools in Dallas is called St. Mark's School of Texas. And when you go look at St. Mark's logo, there is the lion. So why? Why is the lion featured so prominently? And often, it wasn't the case at St. Mark's Catholic School in College Park, Maryland. It's not the case at St. Mark's in Dallas. But typically, when he's featured in iconography, like stained glass windows, it's a winged lion. So the legend from the Coptic Church and early Christendom goes like this. At some point, Peter and Mark were traveling around Italy, what we now call Italy. They're traveling around preaching the good news, and Mark is dutifully writing down whatever Peter is saying. Somehow they got separated. Peter ends up still in Rome or a different part of Italy. Mark ends up in Venice. And as so often happens, because it's so close to the sea, Venice had a huge thunderstorm, and he sought refuge in a small building. And at that time, during this storm, as he's trying to find sanctuary, he had a vision of an angel. And the angel said to him, and I'll spare you the Latin because I'm not very good at that language. I'll spare you the Latin, but the message of the angel was, "Peace to you, Mark, my evangelist." Peace to you, Mark, my evangelist. And so all throughout Italy, all throughout Egypt, wherever we see Mark venerated, we see this Pax to you, Marcus, and so on. Peace to you, Mark, my evangelist. The angel, unlike we see so many times in our Easter stories, where it's a person in human form with white robes or glistening white features, the angel in the story, that the legend of Mark as the evangelist, the angel was the form of a winged lion. And so when you go back and look, and I encourage y'all to do this on the internet after church, when you go back and just say St. Mark artwork, St. Mark veneration, he's almost always pictured with his gospel, the book, holding in his hand, and then somewhere overhead or over his shoulder is a winged lion, the form of the angel saying, "Peace to you, my evangelist." And after all, what is an evangelist? It's someone who's bringing the good news out into the world. And Mark, after all, was the first to do that. So Mark, as we mentioned, was tortured and killed in Alexandria sometime around the year 68, and his remains are buried there in Alexandria until the year 828. So basically 800 years later, the Doge, or the principal leader of the Venetian it wasn't an empire, but the Venetian influence throughout that part of Europe, the Doge in Venice said, we need to kind of substantiate our authority as not only a trade center, an economic center, political, but also as a religious center. And so two merchants of Venice, just like Shakespeare talked about, two merchants of Venice go down to Alexandria, Egypt, get the remains of St. Mark, and bring it to Venice 800 years after his death. And on that site, the legend grows, now at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, which is right on St. Mark's Square, his remains are buried in the basilica there in Venice for the last 1,200 years. What a story. And so that's the reason that when you go look up St. Mark and say, okay, well, who's, every saint's basically the patron of something. Who's St. Mark the patron of? You see this kind of weird, until you research it, disconnect. He's the patron saint of Venice, and he's the patron saint of Egypt. So there you go. That's the story as we know it. But worth, of course, remembering even here in America in 2024, because the legend fits consistently with what Jesus told us in our gospel lesson today. If Jesus is the vine and God is the vine grower, then Mark was certainly one of its strongest branches. And even here today, in America, thousands of years later, we remember the words of Mark and the very basic message that he told, that we should follow the lead of Jesus. As a leader by example, we recognize that our commitment is to service and our commitment is to sacrifice, just like Jesus did for us. And so in our first lesson today, when we hear about Philip the eunuch, it's a perfect example, or Philip teaching the eunuch, it's a perfect example of what Mark and Jesus had in mind. You see, the Spirit calls to Philip and says to him, Philip, you need to go talk to this man over here in the chariot. And Philip does. And it's this person who wants to know the word of the Lord and yet asks in very plain terms, Philip, how can I understand what I'm hearing from Isaiah if I don't have someone to explain it to me? Philip is a perfect example of what Mark is trying to accomplish through his gospel and exactly what Jesus tells us the vine and the branches are about. Philip's a great example of being one of those branches who led to not only the immediate education of the eunuch, but as the chariot drives by a body of water, says, hey, the eunuch says, Philip, what's to keep me from being baptized? And they both agree, nothing. Let's go do it. And so a great example of how we, 2,000 years later, can take these stories, like Philip educating the eunuch and then baptizing him immediately upon his education, as signs that we have to continue our role, not just as the vine, as the branches, but to educate folks and encourage them to receive baptism. Because it's through that baptism that we, just like John says in our lessons today, that we abide in Jesus and he abides in us. So sitting here in the almost last week of Easter, in this fifth week of Easter, I hope that y'all will take out into the world this message of good news, and that you may not get the opportunity to sit down and read scripture to someone and immediately baptize them, but I hope that if you have the chance to say to someone, here's what Jesus is, here's who Jesus was, here's who Mark was, and here's what the good news means, that you'll take it, let the Spirit guide you to do that, because we are, after all branches on the vine. Amen.